Did you decide to pull on Mualani and now wondering what teams to put her in? Or are you just curious about Mualani's potential and how she synergizes with most characters? Well, you've come to the right place. In this video, we'll cover what sort of playstyle is best for Mualani, the best team composition, and a tier list covering most of the relevant characters to her. Keep in mind, though, that this video is not entirely objective, and may be subject to change with upcoming characters in the future. The tier list in the video will also revolve around being used with Mualani, not a general tier list of the characters. Before that, let's have a quick overview of what Mualani does. Mualani is a Hydro Catalyst from Mualani, and any character from Mualani utilizes Night Soul points and Night Soul bursts. Her skill makes her ride her surfboard, giving her a different basic attack, and her burst launches a Hydro Rocket, dealing AoE damage. Both her skill and her bursts scales with her max HP. So far, a Vaporize focus team is where she shines the most. With a composition of Mualani, a Pyro applicator, Dendro or other flexible units, and a flexible support. Now let's start with the Pyro characters options you can use. First, Xiangling. She's honestly the best option for Mualani for the time being. She has a good Pyro application, really good damage, especially in Vaporize, and only need a short on-field time, giving you a faster character swap cycle. An absolute must, if not close to a must-have for Mualani, a solid S tier. Next, we have Dehia and Thoma. Dehia is slightly better than Thoma in this case, but they both do the same thing. They give your team some sustain, while applying Pyro on the enemy pretty well, so they both go into the A tier. Next up, Bennett. He doesn't have the best Pyro application, and his buff doesn't affect Mualani since she scales with max HP, but he can still heal your team up, give your other characters the flat attack buff. You can probably have double Pyro with Xiangling and Bennett, but for that, he will go in the B tier. Lastly, in the C tier, we have these three characters, Klee, Amber, and Xinyan. They don't have that good of a Pyro application, but you can use them if you don't have anyone else. Klee can be in a higher ranking, only if she has C4, so she'll stay in C tier for that. Other characters here are on-field DPS, and Chevreuse only works for an overload team. For the third slot, this can either be a Dendro or other character as your second sub-DPS. You have plenty of options for this one. But let's start with the Dendro characters. First off, the Dendro Archon herself, Nahida. Her skill will give you a consistent enough burning, just like with Burn Melt Ganyu teams. But she's not as consistent in a Burn Vape team, and her EM scaling will be somewhat wasted, so she'll be in the high A tier, almost in the S tier. She's good, but will perform much better in other teams like a Nilou Bloom team. Next up, we have Emily. She can apply Dendro pretty consistently on the enemy, especially with her burst. Apart from that, she can do a lot of damage herself with burn happening. In my opinion, she's in the S tier, being able to have a good Dendro application, and a really good sub-DPS. Then let's talk about Baizhu and Yao Yao. They're both Dendro sustain characters, with a decent Dendro application. They can both fill the Dendro applicator and healer-shielder role in the team, so I'm putting both of them in the A tier. Baizhu is a slightly better option, so if you have him, use him over Yao Yao. Kirara is also another Dendro sustain you can use. The downside is that she needs longer on-field time, and she doesn't apply that much Dendro off-field, like Baizhu or Yao Yao. For that, she'll be in the B tier. Kole is also a good option if you don't have any of the Dendro character mentioned so far, though she can only apply consistent Dendro with her burst, so she'll sit in the B tier. Dendro Traveler, while having a similar kit to Kole, is a much worse option. With a Pyro character on the team, Traveler's burst will explode upon contact with Pyro, thus will not be applying Dendro anymore. Dendro Traveler will be in the D tier. The rest of the Dendro characters will not work at all in a Mualani team, so we'll skip over them. You can also run another Hydro with Mualani to get the synergy that gives 25% max HP. Yelan fits the role really well as a Hydro sub-DPS. She has good Hydro application, a lot of damage, and she scales with max HP as well, so she synergizes really well. All of those puts her in the S tier. Furina can also be used as a Hydro sub-DPS. She has a really consistent Hydro application, she does good damage, and she gives your whole team a damage % buff. The only downside is that you might need to bring a healer with how she lowers your whole team's health. But honestly, that's not that big of a downside compared to what she offers, so she will sit in the S tier. You can also use Mona as your Hydro buffer. Though she could give your team more damage than Furina, Mona's burst effect doesn't last that long and is less consistent. She can still be a good option though, so she will be in the A tier. Up next, let's talk about Xingqiu and Candace. Xingqiu here is a slightly worse Yelan since he doesn't synergize with the max HP buff. While Candace, on the other hand, scales with max HP, and while her burst's Hydro infusion doesn't change anything with Mualani, it will give your team more damage with elemental-infused normal attacks. Keep in mind that while Mualani is riding her surfboard, the normal attack she does is counted as normal attack damage, so both of them will be in A tier, as they're good 4-star options. Ayato will go into the C tier. He can be a good sub-DPS, but he requires a decent amount of on-field time, and he only partially scales with max HP, offering nothing else. Next, Nilou, D tier. She won't work with Mualani since most of her damage comes from her Super Bloom. Maybe you can play Mualani and Nilou in a Bloom team, but Mualani doesn't work that well at all in a Bloom team. You can still do that if you really want. Other than Hydro and Dendro, you can technically use any Anemo character with the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, but we're making a tier list here, so let's rank them. Kazuha will go straight to the S tier. Apart from the VV Shred, he also gives elemental damage bonus to the whole team, and has a little bit of grouping. No doubt will be the best Anemo for Mualani. Then in A tier, we have Sucrose. Instead of the elemental damage bonus, she will give elemental mastery to the whole team, increasing the damage of the vaporize you'll do. Lynette can also work, and she gives a small attack buff, which unfortunately doesn't affect Mualani. But it'll help your Pyro character, like Xiangling, for example. B tier. Venti can give you a really good grouping and some extra energy, but honestly, he's only good against small enemies and is almost useless against bosses. B tier. Anemo healers are also good options. Between Jean and Sayu, Jean is much better, doing more damage and quicker healing, while Sayu can be a decent option, but she might take too much on-field time. So we're putting Jean in the B tier and Sayu in the C tier. Anemo Traveler will be put in the D tier as the skill animation is too long and the burst is going to make it harder to hit some enemies. You can also use a Geo character in the 3rd slot, especially if you use Geo on the 4th slot. Kachina works surprisingly well with Mualani, especially with the 4-piece scroll, giving elemental damage bonus to the whole team. Good off-field damage, while providing the buff from the 4-piece scroll, makes her a high A tier for sure. Chiori, on the other hand, provides a lot of off-field damage, and honestly, she doesn't need that much time on the field. So she'll get an A tier, a bit lower than Kachina. Albedo does about the same thing. Good off-field damage and little on-field time, and his burst will give your team 125 elemental mastery, meaning more damage for Vaporize. His damage is much lower than Chiori though, so he's going to be in the high B tier. Lastly, Yunjin. She might sound good with how she buffs normal attacks, but it's really not consistent and the buff isn't as significant as you think. Usable, but not that good. D tier for me. Then let's talk about the 4th slot, the flexible options. Of course, this is a flexible option, so you can technically put any characters here, but the best would be to have either a sustain character to keep your team alive, or a buffer to increase your team's damage in any way. So we'll categorize it that way. Let's start with the most obvious option, Zhongli. He has the best shield in the game still that can reduce the enemy's elemental resistance, while keeping your characters alive. If you have him, and are not using him in a Hu Tao team, then there's no reason for you not to use him. He's a solid S tier. Kazuha is also another option. He can increase your team's elemental damage, and with 4-piece Verdescent, he can also reduce the enemy's elemental resistance. You might need some sustain when running him instead of Zhongli, but with the damage increase he can give, he's still an S tier. You can use Kachina for the 4-piece scroll buff, A tier like earlier. Any other Anemo character that we've talked about in the 3rd slot can also work, but of course Kazuha will be the best option out of them all. Baiju or Yao Yao will also work if you still need some sustain, and also if you're planning to use Furina. They're still in the A tier. Bennett deserves a place in the B tier. He's a good option for the 4th slot as well. Kirara also works for the shield she gives. The only downside is she needs a lot of enemies to get her max shield fast. Other than that, she's still a B tier. Noelle can be a good option for sustain if you don't have anything else, but she won't have that much chance to utilize her burst with Mualani. So she's better off as a Geo DPS, so I'm putting her in the C tier. Other healers could work if you really need heals, though may not be optimal. Sijuwine can work well as she scales with max HP as well, and she can do some damage herself along with giving Hydro Synergy for increased max HP. She's a B tier. Barbara and Kokomi are both in the C tier. Honestly, with Mualani Vaporize, you don't need consistent Hydro application. Both Barbara and Kokomi might steal the Vaporize first before Mualani while barely doing damage, lowering your overall DPS. Kokomi has better heals, but that's about it. They're not in D tier since they can trigger the Hydro Synergy for Mualani. Next, we have Kuki, one of my favorite characters, but she won't be that good with Mualani. Other than the heals, she doesn't offer anything else. She's much better in a Hyper Bloom team, so I'm putting her in D tier. Cryo healers in general aren't the best either. You don't need freeze for Mualani DPS, so I'll be putting Cheek, Layla, Charlotte, and Diona in the D tier. I will not be putting Mika as he's mostly a physical DPS buffer. You can also use Electro sub DPS like Fischl, Yaimiko, and Raiden, but a Taser team is not a go-to for Mualani, so I'll put them in D tier. Now here's the overall tier list, with all of the previous tier lists combined. All of the characters in the F tier have absolutely no synergy with Mualani, so they're not worth using with her. With all of that in mind, let's give you some examples of the best teams you can use with Mualani. I'll be showing you 4 teams, but of course you can make your own according to the tier list before. The first team is a Burn Vape team with Mualani, Xiangling, Emily, and Zhongli. This is generally the best team to use against most content and enemies in the game. You can swap out Xiangling for Dehya, but she'll do way less damage than Xiangling. You can also swap Emily for Nahida if you don't have her, and Zhongli can be replaced with Kazuha or Kachina. The point is to burn the enemies and then vaporize all of them. The second team is a double Hydro team, utilizing the max HP buff to give Mualani more damage. My usual setup is Mualani, Xiangling, Yelan, and Kazuha. Yelan benefits from the max HP buff, while Kazuha will increase the Hydro damage of the team when swirling. You can use Furina instead of Yelan as well. She can give your team a damage buff, but you might need a healer to make sure none of your characters die in battle. So if you're doing that, you can swap out Kazuha for any other sustain character like Zhongli or Baiju. The third team is Double Pyro, a team that makes triggering Vaporize with Mualani as easy as possible. Apart from that, the attack buff is nice for Xiangling. For this team, we'll be running Mualani, Xiangling, Dehya, and Zhongli or Kachina in the 4th slot. Dehya can be easily swapped with either Toma or Bennett, with Toma obviously being the better option. But you don't really need Zhongli if you're running Toma. So you can run a more F2P friendly team with Xiangling, Toma, and Kachina. Last team featured here is a double Geo team, using Mualani, Xiangling, Kachina, and Zhongli. Kachina will be using the 4-piece scroll, of course. You can replace any of the 2 Geo here with other Geo characters like Shiori or Albedo, and it won't change things too much. In my opinion, Kachina and Zhongli will be the most optimal. Other teams like Taser, Bloom, or Freeze might work, but it's nowhere near optimal to play Mualani in. You can go have fun with them in the overworld and domains, but I wouldn't recommend using them in Spiral Abyss or any other endgame content. Honestly, just play her in any sort of Vaporize team, and she'll do just fine. But you might be wondering, what's this thing I've been using for the tier list? Well, it's a website called Tactor. You can make your own guide and tier list, or find other people's guide and tier list on games like Genshin Impact or Zenless Zone Zero on their website. All you need to do is to make an account, log in, and you can start searching or creating guides. If you've got a different opinion on someone's guide, you can leave a comment or give them your own tier list to let them know. Check out our guides on the website. We currently have 2 of them posted. And leave a comment on the post if you like it or if you disagree with it. Any constructive criticisms are always welcome. That's all from me about Mualani's team composition. I hope this video can help some of you. See you next time. Cheers!